The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on June 15, 1981, as Captain Robert "Bobby" Mitchell performed his final pre-flight inspection of the twin-engine Cessna 421 Golden Eagle. The aircraft gleamed white against the tarmac of Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, its registration number N4827X clearly visible on the fuselage. At 34 years old, Bobby was considered one of the most experienced charter pilots in the Southwest, with over 3,200 flight hours logged and an impeccable safety record. The morning had started routinely enough. Bobby arrived at the airport at 6:30 a.m., coffee in hand, ready for what should have been a straightforward charter flight to Albuquerque, New Mexico. His passenger manifest showed 3 clients: Dr. Theodore Hoffman, a prominent geologist from the University of Arizona; Catherine Walsh, a mining survey specialist; and Raymond Blackwood, a wealthy investor interested in mineral rights across the Southwest. Bobby's wife, Linda, had kissed him goodbye that morning, as she always did, reminding him about their dinner plans with her parents that evening. Their 2 children, Tommy, age 8, and Rebecca, age 6, had barely looked up from their Saturday morning cartoons as their father left for work. It was supposed to be a routine day. The Cessna 421 was loaded with surveying equipment, geological samples, and topographical maps. Dr. Hoffman had chartered the flight to conduct aerial surveys of potential copper mining sites in the remote desert regions between Arizona and New Mexico. The plan was simple: depart Phoenix at 8 a.m., conduct low-altitude surveys over the target areas, land in Albuquerque for refueling and lunch, then return to Phoenix by early afternoon. Weather conditions that morning were ideal for flying. Clear skies stretched endlessly across the desert landscape, with visibility extending well beyond the required minimums. Winds were light and variable, and the temperature, while rising, was still manageable for the aircraft's systems. Bobby had filed his flight plan with air traffic control, indicating a cruising altitude of 8,500 feet and an estimated flight time of 2 hours and 15 minutes to Albuquerque at precisely 8:03 a.m. The Cessna lifted off from runway 08R at Phoenix Sky Harbor. Bobby's voice crackled over the radio as he checked in with Phoenix Departure Control. Phoenix Departure. Cessna 4827X with you, climbing to 8,500, heading 0. Cessna 4827X, Phoenix Departure, radar contact. Climb and maintain 8,500, proceed on course, came the controller's routine response. For the next 47 minutes, the flight proceeded normally. Bobby maintained regular contact with air traffic control, reporting his position as he crossed various navigation checkpoints. His passengers were engaged in animated discussion about the geological formations visible below, pointing out features of interest and consulting their maps and aerial photographs. The last radio transmission from Bobby came at 8:50 a.m., when he contacted Albuquerque Approach Control. Albuquerque Approach Cessna 4827X, 8,540 miles southwest. Request vectors for the ILS approach to runway 08. The Albuquerque controller responded immediately. Cessna 4827X. Albuquerque approach, continue present heading, descend and maintain 6,000. Expect vectors to final approach course in 15 miles. Bobby acknowledged. Descend and maintain 6,000, Cessna 4827X. Those were the last words ever heard from Captain Robert Mitchell when the Cessna failed to check in again after 5 minutes. The Albuquerque controller attempted to re-establish contact. Cessna 4827X, Albuquerque. Approach. How do you read? Silence. Cessna 4827X. If you read, squawk ident. Nothing. After 10 minutes of unsuccessful attempts to contact the aircraft, the controller initiated emergency procedures. He immediately notified his supervisor and began coordinating with other air traffic control facilities to determine if the aircraft had been picked up on other radar systems. The radar data showed that N4827X had been flying normally at 8,500 feet when it began its descent toward Albuquerque. The aircraft's transponder signal had been strong and clear, indicating normal aircraft systems. Then, at 8 hours 50 minutes and 23 seconds a.m., the radar return simply vanished. One moment the aircraft was there, the next it was gone. At 9:15 a.m., when the Cessna was now 25 minutes overdue for its next radio check, The Federal Aviation Administration officially declared the aircraft missing and initiated search and rescue operations. The U.S. Air Force Rescue Coordination Center at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois was notified, and they began coordinating assets for what would become one of the largest search operations in Southwest aviation history. Linda Mitchell was at the grocery store when she received the phone call that would change her life forever. The voice on the other end was professional but sympathetic, an FAA official informing her that her husband's aircraft had lost radio contact and was overdue at its destination. "What does that mean exactly?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. As she abandoned her shopping cart in the cereal aisle, "Ma'am, it means we're not sure where the aircraft is right now. We've initiated search and rescue operations, and we're doing everything we can to locate your husband and his passengers." Linda's world began to spin. Bobby had been flying for over a decade. He was careful, methodical, and had never had so much as a minor incident. This couldn't be happening. "How long has it been since you heard from him?" she managed to ask. "The last radio contact was at 8:50 this morning. The aircraft was on approach to Albuquerque and should have landed by now." Linda looked at her watch. 10:30 a.m. Bobby had been missing for an hour and 40 minutes by noon. Search aircraft were airborne, beginning systematic searches of the flight path between Phoenix and Albuquerque. The initial search area covered approximately 2,400 square miles of some of the most rugged and remote desert terrain in the American Southwest. This was not friendly territory for downed aircraft. Vast expanses of desert punctuated by mesas, canyons, and mountain ranges that could easily hide a small aircraft. The Civil Air Patrol mobilized dozens of volunteer pilots and aircraft for the search effort. These were experienced aviators who understood the challenges of desert flying and the urgency of finding survivors. In the desert, time was critical. Summer temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and without shelter and water, survival times were measured in hours, not days. Dr. Hoffman's wife, Margaret, received a similar phone call at their Tucson home, a geology professor herself. She understood the terrain where her husband was conducting his research. The area between Phoenix and Albuquerque included some of the most desolate regions of the Sonoran Desert, places where a downed aircraft could remain hidden for years. Catherine Walsh's brother, a mining engineer in Denver, immediately flew to Phoenix to assist in the search coordination. He brought detailed topographical maps of the mineral survey areas that Catherine had been planning to investigate. Hoping these might provide clues about the aircraft's intended flight path, Raymond Blackwood's business partners hired a private search company to supplement the official rescue efforts. They brought in specialized aircraft equipped with forward-looking infrared FLIR systems, hoping the heat signatures might help locate the aircraft or survivors. The search continued for 72 hours straight. Aircraft flew grid patterns at low altitude, systematically covering every square mile of the search area. Ground teams using four-wheel drive vehicles and all-terrain vehicles accessed remote areas where aircraft couldn't safely operate. Experienced desert guides led horseback parties into narrow canyons and rugged terrain that vehicles couldn't reach. The challenges were immense. The search area included terrain that varied from flat desert floor to mountainous regions exceeding 7,000 feet in elevation. Deep canyons could hide an aircraft from overhead observation, while the desert's heat shimmer made visual searches difficult during midday hours. The aircraft's white and blue paint scheme, while visible against most backgrounds, could blend into the desert landscape under certain lighting conditions. On the second day of searching, hope briefly flared when a Civil Air Patrol aircraft reported sighting what appeared to be aircraft wreckage in a remote canyon. A ground team was dispatched to investigate, requiring a 5-hour hike through difficult terrain. The wreckage turned out to be the remains of a 1950s-era military aircraft that had crashed decades earlier and was already known to authorities. Another false alarm occurred when searchers discovered pieces of aircraft aluminum scattered across a mesa. Investigation revealed these were remnants from a different aircraft that had crashed in the area several years earlier. Each false lead consumed precious time and resources while extending the agony for the families. Waiting for news by the fourth day, searchers had covered over 5,000 square miles without finding any trace of N for 8 to 7X. The official search area was expanded to include the possibility that the aircraft had deviated from its filed flight plan or had been blown off course by unexpected weather phenomena. Meteorologists were consulted to determine if any unusual atmospheric conditions on June 15th might have affected the flight. While the surface weather had been ideal, Analysis revealed the possibility of high-altitude wind shear that could have caused control problems for the aircraft. However, Bobby Mitchell was an experienced pilot who would have been capable of handling such conditions. The search technology available in 1981 was primitive compared to modern standards. GPS navigation didn't exist for civilian aircraft. Emergency locator transmitters, ELTs, were mandatory equipment, but the early models were notoriously unreliable. Ground-based direction-finding equipment was used to try to locate any ELT signals, but the rugged terrain interfered with radio propagation. Aircraft involved in the search included U.S. Air Force helicopters, Civil Air Patrol aircraft, Border Patrol planes, and numerous privately owned aircraft volunteered by concerned pilots. At the peak of operations, more than 30 aircraft were simultaneously searching different sections of the expanded search area. The human cost of the intensive search became apparent when a Civil Air Patrol aircraft was forced to make an emergency landing due to engine problems. While the crew was rescued without injury, the incident highlighted the dangers faced by search personnel operating in the challenging desert environment. Ground search teams faced extreme conditions. Daytime temperatures exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, making midday operations dangerous for personnel. Searches were conducted primarily during early morning and evening hours, when temperatures were more manageable. Even so, several search team members required medical treatment for heat exhaustion. The psychological toll on the families was devastating. Linda Mitchell maintained a vigil at the Phoenix Search Headquarters, refusing to leave despite pleas from family and friends. She insisted on being immediately available for any news about her husband. Tommy and Rebecca, too young to fully understand what was happening, asked repeatedly when Daddy was coming home. Margaret Hoffman drove up from Tucson to join the families at the search headquarters. As a geologist familiar with the terrain, she provided valuable insights into possible landing sites and survival possibilities in the desert environment. Her technical knowledge proved helpful to search coordinators, but she struggled with the emotional reality that her husband was missing. Media attention intensified as the search continued. Local television stations provided daily updates on the search progress, while national news organizations picked up the story. The mystery of the missing Cessna captured public attention, with tips and possible sightings reported from across the Southwest. One particularly promising lead came from a rancher who reported seeing an aircraft flying unusually low over his property on the morning of June 15th. The timing and description matched N4827X, and the location was within the expanded search area. Ground teams conducted intensive searches of the area, including investigations of every canyon and wash where an aircraft might have crash-landed. Amateur radio operators throughout the region monitored emergency frequencies, hoping to pick up signals from the aircraft's emergency equipment. Radio clubs organized systematic monitoring schedules to ensure continuous coverage of all relevant frequencies. Despite these efforts, no emergency signals were detected. The search entered its second week with no concrete evidence of the aircraft's fate. Families were forced to confront the possibility that their loved ones might never be found. The vast desert had swallowed countless aircraft over the decades, and some were never recovered despite intensive search efforts. Aviation experts, consulted by the media, speculated about possible scenarios. The aircraft could have experienced a catastrophic structural failure, breaking up in flight and scattering debris over a wide area. Alternatively, an in-flight emergency might have forced Bobby to attempt an emergency landing in terrain that proved unsuitable. The possibility of criminal activity was also considered. In 1981, drug smuggling operations were active along the Mexican border, and aircraft were sometimes hijacked or shot down by smugglers protecting their territory. However, N4827X's flight path didn't take it near known smuggling routes, making this scenario less likely. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the official search and rescue operation was scaled back. The decision was agonizing for the families, but search resources were finite, and the probability of finding survivors after 14 days in the desert was virtually zero. The case was reclassified from search and rescue to aircraft recovery, with the understanding that any future search efforts would focus on finding the wreckage rather than survivors. Private search efforts continued sporadically over the following months. Blackwood's business partners funded several additional aerial searches using specialized aircraft. The Hoffman family organized weekend search parties with volunteer pilots. These efforts were hampered by the approaching summer heat, which made desert operations extremely dangerous. By the end of 1981, the disappearance of N487X had become one of Arizona's most famous unsolved aviation mysteries. The case file remained open with the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board, but active investigation had essentially ceased. The families were left with unanswered questions and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing their loved one's fate. The impact on the aviation community was significant. Bobby Mitchell had been well respected among his peers, and his disappearance served as a stark reminder of the risks inherent in desert flying. Charter companies reviewed their emergency procedures and communication protocols, while pilots discussed the importance of flight following and emergency preparedness. For Linda Mitchell, the months following Bobby's disappearance were a blur of grief, anger, and desperate hope. Well-meaning friends suggested she might want to consider the possibility that Bobby had intentionally disappeared, perhaps to escape debts or family obligations. Linda angrily rejected such suggestions, knowing her husband's character and dedication. To his family, the financial impact was devastating. Bobby's life insurance policy wouldn't pay out without a death certificate, which couldn't be issued without proof of death. Linda was forced to sell their home and move in with her parents while she struggled to support Tommy and Rebecca on her secretarial salary. Legal proceedings began as the families of the passengers pursued wrongful death claims against the charter company and aircraft manufacturer. These cases would drag on for years, complicated by the absence of physical evidence about what had caused the crash. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered discrepancies in the aircraft's maintenance records. While N487X had been properly maintained and certified airworthy, questions arose about the installation of some avionics equipment that had been completed just days before the flight. However, without the wreckage, it was impossible to determine if equipment problems had contributed to the accident. Psychics and self-proclaimed experts contacted the families with claims about the aircraft's location. These tips were investigated when they seemed credible, but none led to any discoveries. The combination of false hope and cruel disappointment added to the family's suffering as 1981 drew to a close. Harsh reality set in that N487X and its occupants might never be found. The desert had claimed another aircraft, adding to the long list of aviation mysteries in the American Southwest. The families, the pain of not knowing was almost worse than confirmed death. Couldn't properly grieve, couldn't achieve closure. The case remained in the public consciousness through occasional newspaper articles and television documentaries about unsolved aviation mysteries. Each time the story was retold, the families experienced renewed anguish and false hope that new attention might lead to a breakthrough. Linda Mitchell never remarried. She told friends that until she knew definitively what had happened to Bobby, she couldn't consider herself a widow. She maintained his personal belongings exactly as he had left them, and continued to file joint tax returns listing him as missing. Her life became a testament to enduring love and hope against impossible odds. The children grew up without their father, struggling with questions about what had happened and why Daddy never came home. Tommy, the older child, became fascinated with aviation and announced his intention to become a pilot so he could search for his father. Rebecca withdrew into herself, creating elaborate fantasy scenarios where her father was stranded on a desert island but would eventually find his way home. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, the families organized a memorial service at the Phoenix airport. Hundreds of people attended, including fellow pilots, search volunteers, and community members who had been touched by the story. The ceremony provided some measure of closure, but the fundamental questions remained unanswered. The desert kept its secrets, and N487X remained, losing the vast wilderness of the American Southwest, leaving behind only memories, unanswered questions, and families forever changed by an ordinary morning that had become an extraordinary tragedy. The years following the disappearance of N487X settled into a pattern of diminishing hope, punctuated by occasional bursts of renewed searching. By 1983, 2 years after Bobby Mitchell and his passengers had vanished into the desert, the official investigation had been relegated to a cold case file gathering dust in various government offices. But for the families left behind, the search never truly ended. Linda Mitchell had transformed from a traditional housewife into a determined advocate, spending every spare moment researching new search techniques, contacting aviation experts, and following up on reported sightings. Her small apartment was filled with topographical maps, aerial photographs, and correspondence with anyone who might provide a lead. The walls were covered with charts marking previous search areas in different colored pins: red for areas searched by air, blue for ground searches, yellow for areas that remained unexplored. Her dedication bordered on obsession. Concerning friends and family who worried about her mental health, Linda had lost 30 pounds since Bobby's disappearance, her once vibrant brown hair now streaked with premature gray. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper to support herself and the children. But her real job, she insisted, was finding her husband. "People think I should give up and move on," Linda confided to Margaret Hoffman during one of their regular phone conversations. The two women had developed a close friendship, bonded by their shared loss. "They don't understand that I can't live with not knowing until I see wreckage, until I see proof Bobby is still out there somewhere." Margaret understood completely. As a scientist, she was trained to seek evidence and draw conclusions based on facts. The absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. As she frequently reminded herself, her academic colleagues had initially been supportive, but as the years passed, their interest waned. The geology department at the University of Arizona had long since redistributed Theodore's teaching assignments and research projects. The search efforts during the early 1980s were hampered by limitations in technology and coordination. Search aircraft relied on visual observation, Mark I eyeballs scanning the terrain below for any sign of the missing Cessna. The desert was unforgiving. Aircraft wreckage could be hidden in countless canyons, washes, and rocky outcroppings. Even large aircraft had been known to disappear completely in such terrain. Catherine Walsh's brother, Frank, had relocated to Phoenix to coordinate private search efforts. A successful mining engineer, he had the financial resources and technical knowledge to organize sophisticated search operations. Frank hired professional pilots with experience in aerial surveys and equipped them with the best available cameras and recording equipment. "We're going to approach this systematically," Frank explained to the families during a meeting at his Phoenix office in early 1984. "Instead of random searching, we'll create a grid system and document every area we cover. Modern aerial photography techniques will allow us to capture images that can be analyzed later under magnification." The grid system divided the expanded search area into 1 square mile sections, each assigned a unique identifier. Search aircraft would fly predetermined patterns over each section, photographing the terrain from multiple angles. The resulting images would be cataloged and examined by trained photo interpreters, looking for anything that didn't belong in the natural landscape. This methodical approach required significant funding. Frank Walsh contributed the majority of the money, but the families organized fundraising events to support the effort. Church groups, pilot associations, and civic organizations held benefits, raising thousands of dollars for the search operations. The Arizona wing of the Civil Air Patrol remained involved, providing volunteer pilots and aircraft for the search missions. Colonel James Harrison, the wing commander, had made the search for N48-7X a personal mission. Harrison was a veteran military pilot who understood the importance of never leaving anyone behind. "Every pilot who flies over this desert knows it. Could be them someday," Harrison explained to a reporter covering the search efforts. "We don't abandon our own. As long as there's even a remote possibility of finding that aircraft, we'll keep looking." The search area had grown substantially from the original 2,400 square miles to over 8,000 square miles by 1985. Computer analysis of the last known radar contact, combined with wind data and fuel consumption calculations, suggested the aircraft could have traveled much farther than initially estimated. Weather patterns on the day of the disappearance were reanalyzed using more sophisticated meteorological models. Dr. Robert Chen, an atmospheric physicist at Arizona State University, became involved in the case when Margaret Hoffman contacted him about unusual weather phenomena that might have affected the flight. Chen's analysis revealed the presence of mountain wave activity that could have created severe turbulence and downdrafts in the area where N48-7X was last seen on radar. "Mountain waves are invisible to pilots," Chen explained during a presentation. To the search team, they can create powerful downdrafts that can exceed an aircraft's climb capability. If the aircraft encountered such conditions while flying at low altitude, it could have been forced into the ground before the pilot could react. This discovery led to focusing search efforts on areas downwind of mountain ranges where such phenomena were most likely to occur. The terrain in these areas was particularly challenging: steep slopes, narrow canyons, and rocky formations that could easily conceal aircraft wreckage. The introduction of early computer modeling in the mid-1980s revolutionized the search planning process. Frank Walsh contracted with a defense contractor to develop probability models based on the aircraft's last known position, speed, heading, and fuel remaining. The models generated heat maps showing the most likely crash sites, allowing search resources to be concentrated in areas with the highest probability of success. Ground search teams became more sophisticated as well. Frank recruited experienced mountaineers and desert survival experts to lead expeditions into areas too dangerous for casual volunteers. These teams were equipped with modern communications gear, GPS navigation systems when they became commercially available, and specialized search equipment. One of the most promising leads came in 1986 when a prospector reported finding aircraft debris in a remote canyon about 60 miles from the last radar contact. The debris appeared to be from the correct era and aircraft type. A ground team was immediately dispatched to investigate, requiring a challenging 3-day expedition. Into rugged terrain, the debris proved to be from a military aircraft that had crashed in the 1960s. But the discovery highlighted the challenges of desert searching. Metal aircraft parts could survive for decades in the arid climate, creating false targets that consumed time and resources to investigate. Amateur radio operators continued monitoring emergency frequencies, hoping to detect signals from the aircraft's emergency locator transmitter. The early ELT models were notorious for false alarms and failures, but there was always the possibility that the transmitter had been damaged in the crash but might still be functional. Ralph Morrison, a retired electronics engineer and amateur radio enthusiast, made the search for N48-7X his personal project. Morrison had constructed a network of radio monitoring stations throughout Arizona and New Mexico, all connected by telephone lines to his home base in Flagstaff. The system could triangulate radio signals and provide precise location coordinates. For any emergency transmissions, I monitor the emergency frequencies 24 hours a day, Morrison explained to Linda Mitchell during one of her visits to his station. If that ELT is still transmitting, even intermittently, we'll find it. Morrison's dedication was remarkable. He had logged thousands of hours listening to static and occasional false alarms, investigating every signal that might be related to the missing aircraft. His station logs documented hundreds of ELT activations, each one investigated and determined to be from other sources. The psychological toll on the families continued to mount as the years passed. Linda Mitchell's children were now teenagers, growing up without their father and watching their mother. Consumed by the search, Tommy had indeed become fascinated with aviation, but his interest seemed driven more by a desire to find his father than by any passion for flying. Rebecca, now in high school, had become increasingly resentful of the attention and resources devoted to finding her father. During a particularly difficult family counseling session, she confronted her mother directly. "Dad's been gone for 8 years, Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. He's not coming home. I need you to be my mother, not a search coordinator. I need you to live in the present, not in the past." The counselor, Dr. Patricia Reeves, had been working with the family for 3 years. She understood the complex dynamics of ambiguous loss, the psychological trauma of not knowing whether a loved one was alive or dead. Traditional grief counseling was ineffective because the families couldn't progress through the normal stages of grief without confirmation of death. Ambiguous loss is particularly difficult because it prevents closure, Dr. Reeves explained. The families are frozen in a state of hoping and waiting, unable to fully grieve or move forward with their lives. The search efforts had become a double-edged sword. While they provided hope and a sense of doing something constructive, they also prevented the families from accepting their loss and beginning the healing process. The more time and resources invested in searching, the harder it became to consider giving up. Margaret Hoffman had developed a different coping strategy. As a scientist, she channeled her energy into understanding the technical aspects of the disappearance. She studied aircraft accident investigation techniques, learned about search and rescue operations, and became an expert on desert survival. Her academic approach provided a framework for dealing with the uncertainty. "I can't control whether we find Theodore," Margaret explained to a support group for families of missing persons. "But I can control how much I understand about what might have happened. Knowledge is my way of staying connected to him." Margaret's expertise proved valuable to the search efforts. She developed detailed geological surveys of potential crash sites, identifying areas where aircraft wreckage might be preserved or where it might have been obscured by natural processes. Her scientific approach complemented Frank Walsh's engineering methodology, creating a more comprehensive search strategy. The media attention that had initially helped publicize the search gradually became a burden. Reporters periodically contacted the families, usually around anniversaries of the disappearance, asking for updates and human interest angles. While the publicity occasionally generated new leads, it also forced the families to relive their trauma repeatedly. Television producers approached the families about documentary projects, promising to bring new attention and resources to the search. Some of these productions were respectful and helpful, but others sensationalized the story or promoted questionable theories about what had happened to the aircraft. One particularly painful episode occurred when a tabloid television show claimed to have exclusive evidence about the fate of N48-7X. The show's producers had convinced a man claiming to be a former drug smuggler to tell a fabricated story about shooting down the aircraft to protect a smuggling operation. The story was completely false, but it caused tremendous emotional distress for the families and diverted resources from legitimate search efforts. The financial cost of the extended search operations was staggering. Frank Walsh had spent over $200,000 of his own money by 1990. While the families had exhausted their savings and taken out loans to support the effort, the emotional cost was even higher. Marriages strained by the pressure, children growing up in the shadow of the search, careers derailed by the consuming focus on finding the missing aircraft. Linda Mitchell's relationship with her parents deteriorated as they pressed her to accept Bobby's death and move on with her life. Her father, a pragmatic man who had served in World War II, couldn't understand her refusal to accept reality. "I've seen men die in combat," he told her during a particularly heated argument. "I've lost friends and watched families destroy themselves with false hope. Bobby's gone. Linda, you need to accept that and think about your children." But Linda couldn't accept it. Every few months, there would be a new report of aircraft debris found in the desert, a possible sighting by a hiker or prospector, or a new technology that might help locate the wreckage. Each development rekindled her hope and justified continuing the search in her mind. The introduction of satellite imagery in the late 1980s created new possibilities for the search. Commercial satellite images were becoming available to civilian users, offering the potential to survey vast areas of desert terrain from space. The resolution wasn't sufficient to identify small aircraft debris, but it could detect larger anomalies that might warrant ground investigation. Frank Walsh contracted with a satellite imaging company to photograph the entire expanded search area using the highest resolution sensors available. The resulting images covered over 10,000 square miles and provided unprecedented detail of the desert landscape. Photo interpreters spent months analyzing the images, identifying hundreds of potential targets for ground investigation. The targets proved to be natural geological formations, abandoned mining equipment, or debris from other known aircraft crashes. However, the systematic approach did lead to the discovery of several previously unknown crash sites from earlier decades. Highlighting the desert's ability to conceal aircraft wreckage, Tommy Mitchell graduated from high school in 1993 and announced his intention to join the Air Force as a pilot. His stated goal was to develop the skills and access to military resources that might help find his father. Linda supported his decision. Viewing it as a continuation of the family's search efforts, Rebecca took a different path, accepting a scholarship to study psychology at a university in California. She wanted to distance herself from the search and build a life not defined by her father's disappearance. Her decision created additional tension within the family, as Linda viewed it as a betrayal of Bobby's memory. The early 1990s saw the introduction of GPS, technology for civilian use, revolutionizing navigation and search operations. Frank Walsh immediately recognized the potential and equipped all search aircraft with GPS receivers, allowing precise documentation of areas searched and enabling more efficient grid patterns. GPS also made it possible to create detailed databases of search activities, with every flight path and ground expedition recorded with precise coordinates. This systematic approach prevented duplicate searches of the same areas and ensured that no potential crash sites were overlooked. The decade of the 1990s brought new search technologies and renewed hope. Ground-penetrating radar systems became commercially available, offering the possibility of detecting buried aircraft debris. Metal detectors became more sophisticated and sensitive, capable of identifying aircraft aluminum buried under sand and debris. Thermal imaging technology, originally developed for military applications, became available for civilian search operations. These systems could detect temperature variations that might indicate buried metal objects or disturbed soil patterns that could mark crash sites. Despite these technological advances, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. The search area was simply too vast, and the desert too good at concealing its secrets. Aircraft could be hidden in countless canyons, washes, and rocky outcroppings. Seasonal flash floods could bury debris under tons of sand and gravel. Wind erosion could scatter lightweight components across miles of terrain. The psychological profile of the families had evolved over the years. Linda Mitchell had become the public face of the search, speaking at aviation safety conferences and consulting with other families dealing with missing aircraft. Expertise in search operations and her understanding of the bureaucratic systems involved made her a valuable resource for others facing similar situations. Margaret Hoffman had channeled her scientific training into developing new search methodologies. She published papers in academic journals about the application of geological principles to aircraft accident investigation, contributing to the broader understanding of how wreckage might be preserved or concealed in desert environments. Frank Walsh had become increasingly focused on the business aspects of search operations, developing cost-effective methods for organizing and funding extended search efforts. His experience became a model for other families dealing with missing aircraft cases. The personal costs continued to mount. Linda's health had deteriorated from years of stress and inadequate self-care. She suffered from chronic insomnia, anxiety, and depression requiring medication and therapy to function. Her relationship with her children remained strained, particularly with Rebecca, who had essentially cut off contact with her mother. Tommy's military career provided some hope and purpose to the family's efforts. As an Air Force pilot, he had access to advanced navigation systems in aircraft that could potentially be used in search operations. However, military regulations strictly limited the use of government resources for private search activities. Margaret Hoffman faced her own challenges as a single woman in academia. The demands of the search had affected her career advancement, and colleagues sometimes questioned her objectivity in professional matters related to the case. She had essentially become a single-issue researcher, focusing all her academic work on aspects related to finding her husband. Frank Walsh's business had suffered from his extended absence and divided attention. While his mining engineering expertise was valuable to the search efforts, his consulting practice had declined as clients sought more available professionals. The financial cost of the search had also affected his ability to invest in his business. By 1995, 14 years after the disappearance, the active search operations had largely ceased. The systematic grid searches were complete. The most promising areas had been investigated multiple times, and the financial resources were exhausted. The families maintained their hope and continued to investigate new leads, but the intensive organized search efforts were effectively over. The case file remained open with various government agencies, but active investigation had ended years earlier. The FAA and NTSB had long since concluded that N4827X had crashed somewhere in the desert. But without physical evidence, they couldn't determine the cause or issue a final accident report. Linda Mitchell marked the 14th anniversary of Bobby's disappearance with a private ceremony at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. She stood on the observation deck, looking out at the desert landscape that had claimed her husband, and tried to find peace with the uncertainty that had defined her life for so long. "I don't know if I'll ever stop looking," she confided to Margaret Hoffman, who had driven up from Tucson for the ceremony. "But I know I can't keep living like this. Bobby wouldn't want me to waste my life on an impossible quest." The acknowledgement that the search might be futile was the first step toward accepting a reality that had been too painful to confront. The families had done everything humanly possible to find N4827X. They had organized the most comprehensive civilian search operation in aviation history, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and devoted 15 years of their lives to the effort. The desert had won. It had kept its secret, holding N4827X and its occupants in some hidden canyon or wash where they might remain forever. For the families, the search had become a way of life, a purpose that defined their existence. Now they faced the challenge of learning how to live without that consuming mission. As 1996 dawned, 16 years after the disappearance, the families began the difficult process of transitioning from active searching to passive hoping. They would continue to investigate new leads and maintain their hope for a resolution. But they could no longer organize their lives around the search efforts. None of them could imagine that their long vigil was nearly over, and that the answer they had sought for so long would soon emerge from an unexpected source. The technology that would finally solve the mystery was already in orbit above their heads, capturing images that would soon change everything. Dr. Sarah Chen had never heard of N4827X. When she first noticed the anomaly in the satellite imagery, it was March 15, 1997, and she was working late in her cluttered office at the National Reconnaissance Office, analyzing commercial satellite photographs for a geological survey project. The images, captured by the new generation of high-resolution satellites, showed remarkable detail of the southwestern desert landscape. Chen was a remote sensing specialist with 15 years of experience interpreting satellite imagery. She had developed techniques for identifying man-made objects in natural environments, skills that had proven valuable for both military and civilian applications. Her current project involved mapping mineral deposits in Arizona and New Mexico for the U.S. Geological Survey. The anomaly appeared in a series of images, covering a remote canyon system approximately 70 miles southwest of Albuquerque, New Mexico. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a darker patch of ground in the shadow of a canyon wall. But something about its shape and positioning caught Chen's attention. "That's not natural," she muttered to herself, adjusting the contrast and magnification on her computer screen. The darker area had geometric edges that didn't match the surrounding terrain. Natural shadows and geological formations typically had irregular organic shapes, but this object appeared to have straight lines and angular features. Chen pulled up additional images of the same area taken from different angles and at different times of day. The sun angle varied between photographs, creating different shadow patterns that helped reveal the three-dimensional structure of objects on the ground. In several images, she could see what appeared to be a wing-shaped shadow extending from the main anomaly. The location was in an extremely remote area of the desert, accessible only by helicopter or a difficult multi-day hike through rugged terrain. The canyon was approximately 8 miles from the nearest road and showed no signs of human activity in any of the satellite images. Whatever was creating the anomaly had been there for some time, as dust and debris patterns around it suggested. Years of weathering. Chen documented her findings in a detailed report, including enhanced images that highlighted these suspicious features. However, her job was geological survey work, not aircraft accident investigation. She filed the report with her supervisor and returned to her mineral mapping project. Assuming that someone else would follow up on the discovery if it was deemed important, the report might have been forgotten entirely, if not for a remarkable coincidence. Dr. Michael Reynolds, a former military intelligence officer who had transitioned to civilian remote sensing work, was reviewing Chen's geological reports. As part of a quality control process, Reynolds had extensive experience analyzing satellite imagery for military applications, including the identification of aircraft and vehicles. When Reynolds saw Chen's anomaly report, he immediately recognized the significance of the geometric patterns. The wing-shaped shadow, the angular features, and the size of the object all suggested the possibility of aircraft wreckage. More importantly, Reynolds was familiar with aviation accident cases and knew that several aircraft remained missing. In the southwestern United States, Reynolds conducted additional analysis, using classified enhancement techniques that weren't available to civilian researchers. The enhanced images revealed details that confirmed his suspicions. The object appeared to be the remains of a twin-engine aircraft, partially buried and weathered, but still recognizable as man-made debris. The dimensions matched those of a medium-sized civilian aircraft, and the configuration suggested a high-wing design consistent with several popular aircraft types from the 1970s and 1980s. The wreckage appeared to be relatively intact, suggesting a controlled crash landing rather than a high-speed impact that would have scattered debris over a wide area. Reynolds faced a dilemma. The satellite imagery he was using was classified, and he couldn't officially share his findings without proper authorization. However, he understood the importance of the discovery to potential families of missing persons. After consulting with his supervisor, Reynolds was authorized to contact civilian authorities about the finding on April 3, 1997. Reynolds placed a call to the National Transportation Safety Board office in Washington, D.C. He spoke with investigator Patricia Williams, who handled missing aircraft cases. Reynolds explained that he had identified what appeared to be aircraft wreckage in satellite imagery, but he couldn't provide specific details about the imagery's source due to classification restrictions. Williams was initially skeptical. NTSB received numerous tips about possible aircraft wreckage, most of which proved to be false alarms. However, Reynolds' credentials and his reluctance to provide specific details actually enhanced his credibility. Someone with access to classified imagery wouldn't contact the NTSB unless they were confident in their findings. "You provide coordinates for the location?" Williams asked. "Approximately 34 degrees, 45 minutes north, latitude 107 degrees, 12 minutes west longitude," Reynolds replied. "And databases?" The coordinates placed the potential wreckage in an extremely remote area of New Mexico desert, within the general vicinity where several missing aircraft cases remained unsolved. She cross-referenced the location with open missing aircraft cases and immediately identified N4827X as a potential match. The Cessna, 40 miles from the satellite anomaly location, the timing, aircraft type, and geographical proximity made it a strong candidate for identification. Williams immediately initiated procedures for investigating the potential discovery. However, the remote location presented significant logistical challenges. The site was accessible only by helicopter, and a ground investigation would require specialized personnel and equipment. The NTSB would need to coordinate with local law enforcement, medical examiners, and search and rescue organizations. The first step was aerial reconnaissance, to confirm that the satellite anomaly was indeed aircraft wreckage. Williams contacted the New Mexico State Police, who operated helicopters for search and rescue operations. She also reached out to the Civil Air Patrol, whose volunteer pilots were experienced in aircraft accident investigations. On April 10th, a New Mexico State Police helicopter lifted off from Albuquerque, carrying NTSB investigator Patricia Williams, a state police detective, and a Civil Air Patrol observer. The flight to the coordinates took approximately 45 minutes, crossing increasingly remote and rugged desert terrain. The pilot, Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, the canyon system where the anomaly was located, was at an elevation of approximately 800 feet, with surrounding peaks rising to over 8,000 feet. Wind patterns in the area could be unpredictable and dangerous for helicopter operations. As they approached the coordinates, Rodriguez began a systematic search pattern, flying at low altitude to scan the canyon floors and slopes. The terrain was exactly as described in the satellite imagery, a complex system of interconnected canyons with steep walls and narrow passages that could easily conceal aircraft wreckage. There, Williams called out, pointing toward a shadowed area on the north wall of a narrow canyon. "I can see something that doesn't belong." Rodriguez maneuvered the helicopter for a closer look, carefully managing the aircraft's position in the confined space. The downdraft from the rotor blades stirred up dust and debris, but through the swirling cloud, they could clearly see the unmistakable outline of an aircraft. The wreckage was wedged against the canyon wall, partially buried by years of accumulated sand and debris. One wing was clearly visible, along with portions of the fuselage and tail section. The aircraft's white paint was faded and weathered, but still visible against the red rock of the canyon walls. "That's definitely an aircraft," confirmed the Civil Air Patrol observer, Captain James Morrison, who had participated in dozens of accident investigations. Twin engine configuration looks like a Cessna 400 series based on the wing shape and engine nacelle. Williams documented the scene with photographs and video, capturing the wreckage from multiple angles. The helicopter's limited hovering capability in the confined canyon space made detailed observation difficult, but she could see enough to confirm that this was a significant discovery. The condition of the wreckage suggested that the aircraft had made a controlled approach to the canyon, possibly attempting an emergency landing. The fuselage appeared to be relatively intact, which increased the possibility that human remains and aircraft components might be preserved and recoverable. After completing the aerial reconnaissance, Rodriguez flew the helicopter to a safe landing area several miles away where the team could plan the ground investigation phase. The site's remote location and difficult terrain would require a multi-day expedition with specialized equipment and personnel. Williams immediately contacted NTSB headquarters to report the discovery and request additional resources. She also notified the New Mexico State Medical Examiner's Office as human remains would likely be found at the crash site. The investigation would need to follow strict protocols for both aircraft accident investigation and forensic recovery of human remains. The news of the discovery spread quickly through official channels. Were not immediately notified. Standard procedure required confirmation that the wreckage was indeed the specific missing aircraft before contacting families, to avoid causing unnecessary emotional trauma from false identification. However, word of the discovery began to leak to the aviation community through unofficial channels. Colonel James Harrison of the Arizona Civil Air Patrol received a call from a contact at the NTSB asking about the details of the N48-7X case. "Have an answer?" Harrison told his wife that evening. He had led many of the search flights during the initial disappearance and had never forgotten the case. The thought that the families might finally achieve closure after so many years of uncertainty filled him with both hope and sadness. The ground investigation was scheduled for April 20th, 1997, allowing time to assemble the necessary personnel and equipment. The team would include NTSB investigators, forensic specialists from the New Mexico State Medical Examiner's Office, law enforcement officers, and technical specialists with experience in aircraft accident investigation. Access to the crash site required a helicopter insertion followed by technical rope work to reach the wreckage in the narrow canyon. The investigation team would need to establish a base camp and conduct the recovery operation over several days, working in difficult conditions at high altitude in the desert environment. Meanwhile, Patricia Williams began the process of researching the N48-7X case file, reviewing the original search efforts and gathering information about the missing aircraft and its occupants. The case file was extensive, documenting the massive search operation that had been conducted in 1981 and the ongoing private search efforts that had continued for years. Williams was impressed by the thoroughness of the original search operations and the dedication of the families who had never given up hope. She understood that this discovery would have profound emotional impact on people who had spent 16 years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The technical preparations for the ground need specialized equipment for working in the confined canyon environment, including ropes, harnesses, and technical rescue gear. Forensic recovery equipment would be required for properly documenting and collecting human remains. Aircraft investigation tools would be needed for examining the wreckage and collecting components for analysis. Weather conditions in the area could change rapidly. The investigation would need to be planned around weather windows that would allow safe helicopter operations and groundwork in the exposed canyon environment. On April 18th, 2 days before the scheduled ground investigation, Williams received authorization to contact the families of the missing persons. The aerial reconnaissance had provided sufficient evidence to confirm that the wreckage was likely N48-7X, and the families deserved to be notified before the news became public through media channels. Williams's first call was to Linda Mitchell in Phoenix. After 16 years of waiting, Linda had almost stopped expecting phone calls about her husband's case. When her phone rang that Friday afternoon, she assumed it was a telemarketer or routine business call. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Patricia Williams from the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm calling about your husband's aircraft, N4827X. Linda's heart stopped. "Always come through written correspondence or local officials. We believe we've located the wreckage of your husband's aircraft," Williams continued. "I want to be clear that we haven't completed our investigation, but satellite imagery and aerial reconnaissance have identified aircraft wreckage in a remote canyon in New Mexico that matches the description and location consistent with N48-7X. Linda couldn't speak. After 16 years of searching, 16 years of hope and disappointment, the call she had dreamed of receiving had finally come. Meant that Bobby was really gone, that the hope she had clung to for so long was finally extinguished. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you there?" Williams asked gently. "Yes, I'm here," Linda managed to say. When did you find it?" "The wreckage was first identified in satellite imagery last month. A ground investigation next week to recover." To complete the investigation, Williams explained the logistics of the recovery operation and the timeline for completing the investigation. She emphasized that the identification hadn't been definitively confirmed, but the evidence strongly suggested that this was the aircraft they had been searching for. Similar calls were made to Margaret Hoffman and Frank Walsh. Each family member reacted differently to the news, some with relief that the uncertainty was finally ending, others with renewed grief as they confronted the reality that their loved ones were truly gone. Margaret Hoffman's response was characteristically scientific. "What's the level of confidence in the identification?" she asked. "What evidence confirms that this is Theodore's aircraft?" Williams explained the circumstantial evidence, the location, aircraft type, timing, and lack of other missing aircraft. In the area, however, definitive identification would require examining the aircraft's serial numbers and other identifying features during the ground investigation. Frank Walsh's reaction was more emotional. Despite his engineering background and systematic approach to the search efforts, he broke down when he received the news about his sister Catherine. 16 years of controlled grief suddenly overwhelmed him as he realized that his long search was finally ending. "I need to be there," he told Williams. "I need to see the site where the aircraft is located." Williams explained that family members wouldn't be allowed at the actual crash site during the investigation, but she would coordinate with them to provide regular updates on the recovery progress. The investigation site was too dangerous and confined to accommodate non-essential personnel. The news of the discovery quickly spread through the aviation community and the media. Local television stations in Phoenix and Albuquerque picked up the story, and national news organizations soon followed. After 16 years, the mystery of N487X was finally approaching resolution. The families found themselves once again dealing with media attention. But this time, the focus was on closure rather than the uncertainty that had defined the previous coverage. Reporters wanted to know how they felt about the discovery, what they planned to do next, and how the long search had affected their lives. Linda Mitchell struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of her was relieved that the search was over and that she would finally know what had happened to Bobby. But another part of her felt guilty for being glad that her husband was dead, even though she had known intellectually that he couldn't have survived 16 years in the desert. "I've been preparing for this moment for 16 years, she told a reporter. "But I'm not sure anyone can really prepare for learning that someone you love is gone forever." The ground investigation was scheduled to begin on April 20th, weather permitting. The team assembled in Albuquerque the evening before, reviewing plans and conducting final equipment checks. Everyone involved understood the significance of the operation, not just as an aircraft accident investigation, but as the final chapter in one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. Patricia Williams spent the evening reviewing the case file one more time, studying photographs of the missing aircraft and its occupants. Bobby Mitchell had been a skilled pilot with an excellent safety record. Dr. Theodore Hoffman had been a respected scientist conducting important research. Catherine Walsh had been building a successful career in mining survey work. Raymond Blackwood had been a successful businessman with a wife and children, for lives had been cut short on that June morning in 1981, and their families had spent 16 years in limbo, unable to grieve properly or move forward completely. Tomorrow's investigation would finally provide the answers they had sought for so long. But Williams knew that those answers would bring pain as well as closure as she prepared for sleep in her Albuquerque hotel room. Williams reflected on the remarkable sequence of events that had led to this discovery. A routine geological survey, analyzed by a specialist who happened to notice an anomaly, reviewed by an expert who recognized its significance, and brought to the attention of investigators who could act on the information. Technology had finally provided the breakthrough that 16 years of searching hadn't achieved. Satellite imagery with resolution unimaginable in 1981 had revealed the secret that the desert had kept hidden for so long. Tomorrow would begin the process of recovering not just aircraft wreckage, but the final chapter of a story that had haunted 4 families for 16 years. The morning of April 20th dawned clear and calm, providing ideal conditions for the helicopter insertion and technical rope work required to reach the crash site. The investigation team assembled at the Albuquerque heliport, conducting final safety briefings and equipment checks before departing for the remote canyon where N4827X had waited so long to be found. The helicopter lifted off from Albuquerque at 7:30 a.m., carrying the first wave of investigators to the remote crash site. NTSB investigator Patricia Williams sat beside the pilot, reviewing aerial photographs of the canyon system one final time. In the cargo compartment behind her, forensic specialist Dr. James Crawford checked his equipment for documenting and recovering human remains, while aircraft mechanic and NTSB technical expert Robert Kim prepared his tools for examining the wreckage. The flight to the crash site took 45 minutes. crossing increasingly rugged terrain as they approached, the coordinates identified in the satellite imagery. The morning light provided excellent visibility, and Williams could see the complex network of canyons and mesas that had made ground searching so difficult during the original 1981 operation. There's the site, called out Pilot Sergeant Rodriguez. As they approached the narrow canyon where the wreckage had been spotted, the aircraft remained exactly as it had appeared in the aerial reconnaissance photographs, wedged against the North Canyon wall, partially buried by 16 years of accumulated debris. The helicopter hovered above the canyon while the team conducted a final visual assessment of the site. The wreckage appeared stable, but the narrow confines of the canyon and the steep approach to the aircraft would make the recovery operation challenging and potentially dangerous. Rodriguez identified a landing zone on a mesa approximately half a mile from the crash site. The team would need to hike across difficult terrain and rappel into the canyon to reach the wreckage. The helicopter would remain on standby to provide emergency evacuation capability if needed. After landing, the team spent an hour organizing their equipment and conducting a final safety briefing. The combination of high-altitude, desert environment and technical rope work created multiple hazards that required careful management. Each team member was equipped with emergency communications gear, and strict protocols were established for maintaining contact with the helicopter crew. The hike to the canyon rim took longer than expected, as the terrain proved even more challenging than the topographical maps had indicated. Loose rock, hidden crevices, and unstable surfaces made every step treacherous. The team had to navigate around several obstacles that couldn't be seen in the aerial photographs. At 10:15 a.m., the team reached the rim of the canyon directly above the crash site. Looking down into the narrow gorge, they could see the aircraft wreckage clearly for the first time from ground level. The scene was both remarkable and sobering. N4827X had been hidden in this remote location for 16 years, invisible to the thousands of searchers who had combed the desert looking for any trace of the missing aircraft. The Cessna 421 had come to rest nose first against the canyon wall, with the aircraft's back broken just behind the wing. The tail section had separated and was buried under a pile of rocks and debris approximately 20 feet behind the main wreckage. One wing had been sheared off during the crash sequence and lay crumpled against the opposite canyon wall. Controlled flight into terrain, Kim observed, studying the wreckage pattern. Pilot was flying the aircraft when it hit. This wasn't a breakup in flight or a flat spin. He was trying to land it somewhere safe.